Is Dragon Ball Super's animation any good? Is a question that one might see littered throughout various forums where I am absolutely certain polite discourse takes place. Animation is an iffy thing, but even as recently as a few years ago, I found it exceedingly difficult to define what exactly good animation even was. I knew it had to do with how the show looked, but I had no idea what constituted as specifically terrible or specifically exceptional when it came to watching something that was animated. Many people have spoken on the topic of Dragon Ball's animation, but I don't think many have spoken about what makes the show specifically good or bad, and how the show is doing now. It's very easy to jump onto the bandwagon blindly agreeing with what the popular consensus is. But today I plan to go against the grain. And while I personally can't name most animators working on specific scenes just by looking at it, I do have a qualification in animation, and that has to be worth something. This is a subject I found even animation teachers have difficulty fully explaining, but I'm gonna try my best. So let's find out if Dragon Ball Super's animation is any good. God bless my dislike bar and comment section. If I were to put these two pieces of media next to each other, which one would you be inclined to say has the best animation? While some of you out there might be rolling your eyes, I'm sure some of you might have actually chosen the one on the left. But in actuality, the stick figure has better animation by virtue of the fact that it's actually moving or animated. This might seem obvious for some, but before moving forward, I want to have everyone at least on the same page with regards what to look for. Animation is, in my opinion, one of the most wondrous and incredible forms of entertainment ever created. With a blank canvas, you can illustrate or paint absolutely anything your heart or dreams desire. Animation then takes those drawings and breathes life into them in an incredibly real way. But when it comes to good animation and what to look for, it, like most everything else in the arts, is pretty subjective. But with that subjectivity, there are elements of objectivity sprinkled throughout. I mean, why else would shows like Attack on Titan and One Punch Man be universally praised for their animation, while scenes from Naruto and Dragon Ball become universally panned for their efforts? In short, there can be objectively poorly animated sequences. To best break down why this happens, we need to look at three different types of 2D animation. Now, before I proceed, there aren't just three types of animation to be aware of. The same way there aren't just three primary colors. There's room for infinite variation and nuance within this very general framework. And with that small disclaimer out of the way, let's look at our first topic. When I think of realistic or detailed anime, what comes to mind are films like Ghost in the Shell, not the live action film, and Makoto Shinkai's 2016 mega hit, Your Name. While there are other movies I could probably think of that better fit this title, these are the films that immediately sprung forth from my brain, and I think there's a reason for that. These are all story-driven films at their core. And while detailed and realistic, they all utilize animation in very different ways to enhance their own stories. In the case of Mamoru Oshii's 1995 film Ghost in the Shell, the movie establishes itself as a gritty, visceral take on the sci-fi genre. And it's that gritty, realistic take that gives the film its sense of tension and excitement. This is made all the more clear in one of the final scenes when Major Kusanagi combats the spider tank. Because of the film's animation, we the viewer receive a clear understanding that this world and its characters react very similarly to our own, as opposed to shows like Looney Tunes, whose world's whole point is that nothing is the way it seems. And so despite it being just a robot with some guns going up against our main character, the tension is very real as we know their respective limitations as viewers. Not everything needs beam struggles to create stakes. It's all about perspective. On the opposite side of this section comes Makoto Shinkai's Your Name. While Ghost in the Shell was primarily an action thriller, Your Name is a slice-of-life fantasy romance starring two main characters, Taki and Mitsuha, as they swap bodies numerous times over the course of the film. The primary focus of Your Name's animation is to convey emotion as effectively as possible. There are numerous means to create a sad or emotional scene, but regarding animation, Your Name achieves this through subtle and, in some cases, very subtle character movements. It's clear that the characters' movements were meticulously drawn to convey as much emotion and information as possible to the viewer. Without any context, you can clearly tell that this is Mitsuha inhabiting Taki's body through the movements alone. This is a textbook example of fantastic character acting. It's choices like these that make the characters feel so real. And ultimately, that's the connection most animation wants to achieve at the end of the day. A connection to the characters. This is the section you'll find Dragon Ball, One Punch Man, Naruto, and really most shonen anime occupying. It marries a realistic detail approach with softer exaggerated sequences that usually help convey comedic intent or aid in the flow of motion for action sequences. But, and this is important, There is a limit to how exaggerated a sequence can get before it crosses the line and takes you out of the story that's being told. Unless that craziness is established early on in the show, that threshold is important to keep in mind. I'll touch on this again later. Now, working within those limitations can yield spectacular results. To achieve this, speed lines or smears can be very effective, as when it's played in normal speed, it helps the sequence look more energetic or smooth depending on what you're going for. This is very much common practice with shows like Dragon Ball, where there is a fight almost every episode. Another good example of this, and probably the best textbook example, would come from Haikyuu's 4th OP. In the latter stages, it's clear that the action is ramped up. On top of exaggerating the motions of the characters involved, you'll notice the use of smears also. As you can see, this is an effective way of conveying the intensity or speed of movement. And you might have noticed that Dragon Ball Super also utilizes these techniques. Shin-chan, Space Dandy, and Mr. Osomatsu are just some of the many crazy animated shows that have seemingly no boundaries when it comes to their respective animation styles, despite the fact that all of these animated shows are actually quite different. So if you want crazy, unyielding, psychedelic animated sequences, then these shows are for you and this section is for you. Maybe try Mob Psycho 100 also. That show is gorgeous. Nothing is too over the top and nothing is too bombastic. This exaggerated style specifically works well for comedic shows where comedy takes the front seat over action and drama. While shows like Dragon Ball might be considered comedies, they are first and foremost shown in action stories, and that distinction is important. Giguk recently made a video discussing a certain infamous scene between Naruto and Pain. There is a lot of discussion regarding that scene, and in short, while it's clear a lot of work went into the animation for that sequence, it crossed that threshold I spoke about earlier. It went too far into exaggeration and thus didn't match the Naruto series anymore, taking the viewers out of the action and into a critical mindset. It began to look like a different show entirely. How would you feel if Your Name or Dragon Ball suddenly, in its most important moment, shifted and looked like a different show entirely? Remember, animation's job primarily is to transport you through the story while using techniques to enhance it, not to distract from it. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing about a film is its story. Distracting from that can ruin the experience in most cases. Now, this isn't true for every show, as every show has a different threshold. I could see One Punch Man getting away with something like this due to the show's lighthearted nature. However, Dragon Ball Super, it suffered from the same issues as Naruto. The series had objective trouble in the early days that garnered a ton of bad press for the show. It trended worldwide and even Forbes covered it. Nowadays, people who haven't seen the show's quality for the last number of years will still consider Dragon Ball Super a poorly animated disaster, when really that's not the case, and it hasn't been for years. But people still say it, and consistently stand by it too. In the early days, much of Super's animation that came under scrutiny came from a former Dragon Ball Z key animator, Naoki Tate. Let me be the first to say that he personally is one of my favorite animators on the show from an animation purist point of view. He produces fantastic, fluid work consistently, and honestly, very few can match his efforts in the series when it comes to pure movement. There are other animators working on the show that I personally do not like at all, but I have specifically chosen Tate due to his polarizing style because there is an argument to be made that Naoki Tate, although great, his loose style might not suit the Dragon Ball art style that fans and viewers of the series have come to expect. And much of Dragon Ball Super's flack from a visual standpoint stems from that sentiment. But I hear you asking, why did this happen? He's talented and has a long history with the show dating back to Dragon Ball Z. Well, Dragon Ball's animation had a bigger focus on a comedic style, and thus its round, soft designs and simple animation suited the tone the show was going for. As the years progressed, so too did Toriyama's style, and either by chance or by design, Dragon Ball Z's more serious, darker themes were complemented by an edgier art style and animation practice. It just so happened that Dragon Ball Z specifically became hugely popular, and as a result, that Dragon Ball Z became what Dragon Ball was and meant to the vast majority of fans and the general public. Ask anyone what they know about Dragon Ball and they will mention Super Saiyans or giant beam struggles way more often than they will the Pilaf saga or Goku training with Master Roshi. I mean, there's a reason why the new game is called Fighter Z and not Super Fighters or something. And that's not because those moments in early Dragon Ball don't appeal to a wide number of people. It's just that Dragon Ball Z cemented itself in the minds of the majority as what Dragon Ball is. And understanding that, I think, is the key to all this. In the eyes of a lot of people, Dragon Ball Z is all that matters. And the further they differentiate themselves from Dragon Ball Z, the more pushback there will be. And this is where those animation types we were talking about earlier on come in. Naoki Tate and much of Dragon Ball Super early on did not match the vision fans had in their heads. It was softer, more exaggerated, and had a greater focus on comedy. I think it would be fair to also state that if suddenly Dragon Ball Super adopted an art style similar to, say, Ghost in the Shell, the backlash would be enormous because that style, while brilliant, isn't what fans recognize as being Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z had a much easier transition from a visual point of view for a number of reasons. Dragon Ball was the story of Goku as a child to late teen, and Dragon Ball Z was Goku's story as an adult. And with that age shift came a seamless art style evolution through the years. Dragon Ball Super had the misfortune of following easily one of the most important and successful animes ever in Dragon Ball Z. Sprinkle in a 17-year-long hiatus, and while these animated sequences are great, the nostalgia wanted this. And it's that disconnect that causes that frustration from a visual standpoint. I think, from a technical point of view, its animation is great. It's a shame many fans dismiss Dragon Ball Super's visuals without giving it a second thought these days, because despite being in the middle of an action-heavy arc, the series is in a fantastic place when it comes to animation, artwork, and consistency overall. Every episode looks perfectly fine to amazing. My favorite moment even comes from Naoki Tate, a guy you might have thought I was ragging on, but honestly produces top-notch work. Ignoring the bad animation the series suffered at the beginning, because there's really no sign of it anymore, Dragon Ball Super produces spectacular animated sequences on a regular basis, some that are nostalgic and others that are innovative. And for a show that has such a long history to be able to show me things I haven't seen before, is at the very least I feel worth a second chance. And trust me, I'm not just saying that because I like the show, I'm saying that because the animation genuinely is fantastic. Dragon Ball isn't perfect, but neither is animation or creativity in general. If there was a be-all to end-all solution to the perfect show or animated sequence, then animation and entertainment in general would cease to be creative and become more of a mathematical equation, not to mention boring. That's the beauty of animation and art in general. It's anything that you want it to be. Growing up watching a series is very different to jumping into it later in life. Nothing will ever capture the emotional feeling your younger self had again. And coming to terms with that is both a sobering and, admittedly, a sad concept. But only through understanding that can you move forward and look at modern series with a more critical and fair eye. And it's that I feel is Dragon Ball Super's biggest disadvantage nowadays. As I've demonstrated before, the show looks sensational now, arguably producing better work than Dragon Ball Z at times, if you look at it fairly. And that was the goal of this video, to get you looking at the material fairly, rather than blindly dismissing a show that has clearly improved just because everyone else does. Look at it yourself and be honest about how you feel, and don't worry about what everyone else is saying. No one can claim that objectively Dragon Ball Super is a poorly animated show anymore, the same way no one can say that objectively Dragon Ball Super is a failure, because it all boils down to each individual viewer's unique experiences with the characters and the story. So if Dragon Ball Super is your favorite show, then to you it is a success. And you don't need some guy on a YouTube video to clarify that for you. Or at least you shouldn't.